The families of the fallen are often left in limbo when the remains of their loved ones never return from war. For one American woman whose grandfather died in the attack on Pearl Harbor, that pain transcended generations until she and her family achieved the closure they needed. Now, she's helping other families do the same in the country that was once the enemy. NHK World's Yotsumoto Jun has the story.
The remains of an American Navy officer finally coming home in 2016. 75 years after John Charles England died in the attack on Pearl Harbor. For his granddaughter Bethany Glenn and her family, this was an excruciatingly long-awaited moment.
We suffer in a way that only families left without a sense of closure could possibly understand. It's a sadness that seems to drape over the generations.
England was one of the 429 on board the USS Oklahoma when it was torpedoed and capsized. He escaped topside as the ship began to overturn, but went back 3 times to help comrades to safety. On his 4th attempt, he didn't surface. It was 4 days before his 21st birthday. In his last letter to his parents, written about 2 weeks before the attack, he asked their impression of his firstborn, the girl who would later become Glenn's mother.
The one thing that gets me is that I'll be the last one in the family that gets to see her. Somehow that doesn't seem fair.
Then, the devastating message. Missing in action. No remains recovered. For the family, talking about him became taboo. But after her mother died in 2002, Glenn found boxes of his possessions filled with yearbooks, photos, and letters.
Going through all of those mementos of his, I learned that he was a very well-loved kid. He was the class president in high school. He was just one of those guys that everybody loved.
Glenn's grandfather had been buried with the unknown fallen in a national cemetery in Hawaii. Having learned more about him, she and her family did whatever they could to get his remains back. After an 8-year effort, his skull was returned following DNA identification. They buried England's remains next to his parents. After 75 long years, the family finally achieved some closure.
To be able to have conversations, talk about what he did, and feel good about it, and bring him back alive so we can give him the proper burial that he deserved, and a proper send-off, to the universe, that really felt great.
Around that time, Glenn met a Japanese woman whose experience resonated with her own. Keiko Zeke is the co-founder of OBON Society, a group that helps Japanese families retrieve personal items of relatives who died in battle. Zeke was motivated to start OBON when her family received an item belonging to her grandfather who died in the war. When Glenn learned about Zeke's work, she knew what to do.
Once I found out what OBON Society is doing for Japanese families, I was blown away, and I knew I really wanted to be a part of that, because they were receiving the same closure that my family did.
OBON Society returns flags carried by Japanese soldiers. These good luck charms bear names and words of encouragement from family members and friends. Allied soldiers often collected them from battlefields as trophies. Glenn and Zeke, from former enemy countries, Their experiences forged their alliance and mission to heal war wounds on both sides. Over the past decade, they've helped return over 400 flags to families in Japan.
I don't see any difference of getting human remains, like in my case, or getting a personal remain, like a flag. It is the closure that the family gets. That's what's most important.
OBON Society's work has expanded beyond Japan and the United States. Ahead of the 80th anniversary of the start of the Pacific War, it was invited to talk about its work to people in Europe, which also experienced the atrocities brought by World War II. By speaking to a broader audience, they hope to raise awareness and eventually retrieve more flags that were taken to places other than the United States. Among the participants was a young man who serves in the German military. He said OBON's work fascinates him as he has been studying missing European soldiers from World War II. He also saw the universal message in their activity.
It's also a way of making peace and closing peace too, not only closing the unknown destiny of that soldier who fell somewhere in, I don't know, in the Pacific, but also to make the world a little better too.
Just last month, more news. The rest of Glenn's grandfather's bones had been identified. Now they are finally home, just a day before the Pearl Harbor anniversary.
We just received the rest of my grandfather's remains back, so we are very happy to put him next to his flag and his picture here. A little wrap up and a little closure.
Glenn now has new plans for the 80th Pearl Harbor Day. Instead of attending a ceremony, she'll be watching her grandfather's favorite movie with him beside her. Then she and family members will take him on a road trip, visiting the places where he was born and raised and meeting people whose lives he has touched.
The first time when we buried his skull, we had a very military funeral. This time around, we're going to honor the kid that he was, and honor the playful and the funny and the fun-loving kid that he was.
Glenn says her efforts to bring closure to families in Japan may only have scratched the surface. But she said she'll keep going to help as many families as possible and make the world more aware of the dangers of war. Yotsumoto Jun, NHK World.